Hello and welcome to the Outcomes Over Hours show. I'm Tina Patterson and I'm so excited about the guest that I have here for you to hear from today. Her name is Kaitlin Dumont and she's the Director of Workforce Learning Innovation at Kaplan. So Kaitlin has very deep expertise at the intersection of higher education and workforce learning. Prior to Kaplan, she was involved in helping shape the executive development programs at the Tuck School of Management at Dartmouth College, as well as at Harvard Business School. Kaitlin has been featured in several publications and she's a sought-after speaker on the topic of innovative workforce learning. So welcome to the show, Kaitlin.
Thank you, Tina. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to start off by you sharing your insights into what you're seeing and where you think things are going over the next few years to decade when it comes to workforce learning.
So I will preface my answer by saying my crystal ball is notoriously foggy, but I'm happy to share, sort of what I've gleaned from looking at insights across the whole sector. And by the work-learned sector, I mean post-secondary education, higher education, as well as corporate learning and development education as a benefit and other training programs. And a lot of my thinking was really catalyzed by a conversation I had about a year ago with a CHRO. And we're having this conversation about learning strategy. And I go, oh, you don't have a learning problem, you have a talent problem. And it was just that micro adjustment in the framing that really catalyzed a lot of my work and thinking over the past year, because this particular CHRO would be just as happy to hire talent from the outside with the right skill set as upskill and develop talent internal to the organization, so long as they ultimately delivered upon the goal, which is to drive profitability to the firm. So it was really, how do we begin to architect an entire talent ecosystem around this idea of learning both inside and outside of the organization. And a lot of what I've been seeing and reading over the recent months is this idea of skills-based hiring, which is very buzzwordy right now.
Yep.
But what I'm seeing is that skills-based hiring is falling prey to what I call the say-do gap. We're all talking skills-based hiring. We're all saying skills-based hiring, but how many organizations are effectively doing that? And what I mean by that is employers are saying, okay, we'll remove the degree requirement, and now we're doing skills-based hiring, but that's really only the first step. You need buy-in from senior leadership. You need to think about the hiring managers and training them and teach them how to screen for skills and start to remove bias in that process. And you also need to think about the job description itself. How do you actually write and construct a job description for skills-first hiring? And then once we effectively do skills-first hiring and get talent into the organization, organizations need to be really careful about that entry-level ceiling. It's only the first step getting them in there, but what does that upwardly mobile career trajectory look like? And what is the responsibility of the organization? And I would argue by extension, what is the responsibility of post-secondary and higher education? So rather than just removing the degree requirement, one of my rallying cries has been, let's reimagine it. What does that look like to have that both and for skills-based hiring and career pathing and mobility? So part of that is education as a benefit, which I personally find that phrase a little cringy. I like learning as a strategy, and it really is twofold. It's the individual. How do I support the individual on their educational journey, moving through different programs or educational experiences? And that can run the gamut from a full degree program to micro learning opportunities and learning in the flow of work. And we'll talk about that phrase at some point, I'm sure, and some of the buzzwordiness around that. But how do I curate that for the individual? Because just be like, hey, look at this huge portfolio of education options we have. Huge problem, certainly a problem that Amazon was seeing in their career choice program, which is why they brought on Kaplan as their coaching and advising partner to help curate that experience for the learner. But the individual is only one prong. The other prong is the organization. And going back to my earlier story about that CHRO, how do we think about what are the skills gaps that an organization needs to execute against its strategy? And one other really interesting story, I was talking to another head of L&D, and she was saying that they've actually have a sliding scale for their education benefits program. So if you are taking a program that's aligned with the skills gap to executing against the strategy, that's covered at 100%. But if you want to take something because you're personally interested in it, or she gave the example of nursing, it's not in the healthcare industry. Yes, we need more nurses. That's lovely. This particular organization doesn't need more nurses. So they cover that at 75%. So they're actually incentivizing employees to get an in-demand skill that aligns with the organization's strategy, and then bring it all full circle to the individual. It becomes that much more motivating to the individual when they see the application of their skills to have direct impact on their organization. And if you don't do all those other hard, complicated, interconnected pieces, well, that education as a benefit, you've just paid to upskill your competition's talent, and nobody actually wants to do that. But just a couple of my musings that I'm seeing in the space lately.
Oh, I love that so much. And as you're talking, I love that distinction you make, that CHRO comment around it's a talent problem up front. And I was lucky enough many years ago to work at GE, where they really focused on talent, and I think we're way ahead of their time. But what I've seen, and I'm interested in your views, is when times get tough, whether it's macroeconomic or in a business, learning and development is often one of the areas that's seen as a almost discretionary spend that gets cut. How do you phrase that and think through that with the companies that you work for, so that they really do see the return on investment, knowing that the skills-based learning is the thing that's actually going to get them to achieve their targets?
And as someone who sat on the university side, selling to all of those wonderful corporate learning and development leaders, oh boy, did we feel those economic downturns really hard. And, I really see a couple of things. One, it has to start with the CEO, and it has to start with the top. And in fact, whether it's been Dartmouth or Kaplan or whoever, we've actually curated who we're working with and partnering with by looking for the innovative thought leaders in the senior most position. Because the minute that learning and education as a benefit gets relegated to a subcommittee under the function of HR, the game is over. So it really has to be central to the organization's strategy. So that involves, one, having a real strategy; two, understanding what are the skills gaps to execute against that strategy; and three, prioritizing those skills gaps and then finding the right programs to upskill, because that'll drive profitability. And I love the return on investment question. It's huge. I don't think very few organizations have figured out how to quantify it exactly right. I think it's a little bit more experimental at this stage. But the two really great examples I've seen are, one, thinking about, I like Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. So what's that highest level of evaluation with ROI? And when I was at Dartmouth, we actually would imbue action learning projects into a lot of our programs, where small cross-functional teams, all within the same company, would develop a project based on a framework we were teaching in the program, get some seed funding. In one particular case, there was 10 of them. They pitched them to the CEO. 2 were selected for seed funding, almost like a Shark Tank pitch competition. And then they got to implement, and then they could quantify real ROI, real revenue coming out of these projects that were driven by these learning experiments. The other example I've seen recently, Kaplan hosted a webinar just last week, actually, with a couple of thought leaders, and one was the former CLO of McDonald's. And what he was sharing is that they had a really forward-looking education as a benefit program where, employees at their different restaurants could pick any number one of colleges that they wanted to attend, so long as it was accredited. And even for most community colleges, they did articulation for credit for the managerial training program within McDonald's. So they had essentially 1 year of an associate's degree completely articulated just by their manager training program for that speed to degree. But they found that employees who went through these programs were, oh my goodness, I don't want to mess up the statistics that he shared. So go watch the webinar recording. But I want to say it was like 3x more likely to stay within the firm and 2x more likely to be promoted. Okay, so that's great when it comes to recruitment and retention. But how does that actually translate to hard ROI in terms of sales? Well, they had other data points to prove that individuals in stores with a longer tenure of employee actually drove better outcomes when it came to customer satisfaction, revenue, margins, because they were being more efficient with costs. So then we can extrapolate out actual hard ROI in terms of sales
Wow.
because of training. And he shared that for every $1 they invested in these training and development programs, they had a $3 return. And they were investing some pretty eyebrow-raising amounts in terms of their training and development program. So, it would serve more organizations to think about how do we extrapolate out that hard ROI to build the business case in terms of getting that investment from the top.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. And I'd love to pick up on something you mentioned earlier about learning in the flow of work, which is, yes, you're right, a buzz phrase, but it's a really important one, I think. How do you see that playing out over the coming years?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces of unpacking that. I was actually leading a panel at EdTech Week in New York City last year, and we were calling it very affectionately a hashtag Burson buzzword in honor of Josh Burson. But I think, especially from the colleagues that were on the higher ed side of the ecosystem, they want learning in the flow of work to be the responsibility of post-secondary education. And I don't think it can be. Yes, maybe there's some frameworks or some applications or some thought leadership that come from post-secondary experiences, but to do really effective learning in the flow of work, that's the job of the organization. I think it largely comes down to mentorship and sponsorship, and what are those opportunities the individual is given to flex those muscles and to learn and to be given a safe space to fail. I was actually reading something earlier that there's no such thing as failure. Either you win or you learn. Those are the only two outcomes. There is no failure. So really creating that almost psychologically safe environment where individuals can try and experiment new things, but it has to come from the top. It has to be ingrained in the culture of the organization. And you need to have a mentor or a sponsor or a coach who really gives you those opportunities to learn in the flow of work.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'd also be interested in your views. One of the topics that I'm very, very passionate about is what are the skills that leaders in corporates need, not only now, but if we think about the coming decade or so, what are the skills that they need to amplify now that we're no longer in the office together full time? And for most organizations now, it's some form of hybrid, but it involves moving away from that command and control, I can see you every second of the day, to inspiring people and having clarity. What are the 2 to 3 leadership skills that you are seeing that you believe that leaders in corporate need to start amplifying to be really effective into the future?
Well, please stop doing Zoom trivia and happy hours and karaoke. And those are important for culture and for some folks, but I think employees can usually pass the sniff test when something feels inauthentic and not genuine. I think it comes back to building that culture of trust and accountability. A phrase I've been seeing a lot lately is this idea of a stay interview, and really understanding the motivation of each individual and why they're motivated to be in a flexible work situation and what are the benefits of that. We were discussing a little bit before this interview that, I have young kids, you had young kids. So at this stage in my life, the flexibility comes down to childcare and being able to be mom and those certain hours of the day. That might be different for a colleague who doesn't have children or a colleague who has elderly parents, but really understanding what is the motivation of each person. And I think another piece of it is knowing the moments for what the different modalities of work should be. And what I mean by that is similar to instructional design. What is the modality that's the best use case for each moment of that work experience? So perhaps, if you are going to have in-person hybrid time, that should be dedicated for innovation or team building or the activities that cannot be done as effectively remotely. You always hear the examples, oh, we're hybrid, we're in the office 2 days a week. And when we're in the office, everyone's still on Zoom because half the organization is at home. And what's the point of even coming into the office? I was having a really interesting conversation with the gentleman, I forget his official title, but he's at Fidelity and he's really thinking about their future of work as they build up this new headquarters in Boston. And he was sharing that one of the models they were considering is having intact teams come to the Boston HQ for 1 week a quarter for that dedicated time. And that was going to be their hybrid schedule and remote the rest of the time. So really thinking about what is the modality and what makes the most sense for that particular team, function, organization. And then the final skill for leaders, I would say, is communication, but specifically communication around the strategy. So if you cannot unify your entire organization around the strategy and what that strategic intent is, then the game is over. And the favorite story a faculty at Dartmouth used to share was John F. Kennedy was walking down the halls of NASA and asked a janitor, what is he doing? And he said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And that's the strategic intent, knowing that everyone is charging after the same thing. It's so much more critical in a remote or flexible work environment so everyone can really optimize and maximize their day. That culture of trust and accountability for charging after what is their moon mission. So those are some of the skills that I've been seeing and hearing a lot about.
Yeah, it's very aligned with what I see and hear too. And I think people also think with that communication, well, I've shared the strategy. And you go, hang on, no, it's not a one and done. It is something that needs to continually be anchored back to with what you're doing so people can see, okay, how does my role contribute? You know, I love the story, also the JFK one with the janitor of being clear. You know, I'm really clear what work I'm doing, that it's meaningful in service of our North Star mission that we're going for. So I love that.
I worked with another faculty member who would call it the dead sleep test. You should be able to wake up any member of your team from a dead sleep in the middle of the night, and to one degree or another, they should be able to articulate the strategy. Most organizations fail. So yes, tell them again when it comes to communicating the strategy.
Yep, I love that, the dead sleep test. I haven't heard that one. That's fabulous. Well, Kaitlin, I'd love your thoughts on, as you know, Outcomes Over Hours is all about how do you achieve extraordinary outcomes and have a life outside of work without burnout. And so it's all at the crux of it is around how do you work smarter? So what's the best, most practical advice you've ever received that you've actioned around how you work smarter?
Yes. And I love the title of this show, Outcomes Over Hours. And, you know, I think the one thing I would caution is that it doesn't fall prey to that same say-do gap that we talked about skills-based hiring. It's easy to say, but leaders really need to embody it, not just say it. And from a personal perspective, I grew up in a heavily operational role where when I was leading in my early days programs in executive education at Harvard, we even billed our hours back to the program when we were in program. So it was all about the hours. I mean, outcomes, trust me, were solidly important too, but hours played a key role. And then I had the opportunity to step into a more strategic role. I sort of freaked out. I'm not the only one who's gone from operational to strategic and had that moment of, oh my gosh, am I, cooking enough things off the to-do list? But really understanding the quality of my work product over the quantity of my time was key. So to answer your question, the best piece of advice I got that I actioned, and this sounds small, but was to keep a win list. So when I started to get caught up in that mental trap of, am I doing enough? Am I answering enough emails? Am I online enough? Am I visible enough, especially in a remote setting? Am I visible enough? Just going back to that win list and be like, oh yeah, no, I've actually produced some quality outcomes for my organization, sort of set my own mind at ease, because at least I've been fortunate enough to be in situations where it's come less from a direct manager or senior leadership in that command control structure and more my internal mental trap of, am I doing enough? And being able to reassure myself that, yes, I am doing enough. Keep it up.
I love that. I love that. I have a client who actually has an email folder called Wins, so that when they get an email where someone says, fabulous job on whatever it was, gets stored in the Wins folder. So then when she's having one of those days of going, oh, am I enough? Am I doing well enough? She just reads through what other people have said and the wins to be able to go, no. Okay, time to reset and reframe back to, yeah, I've got this. So fabulous.
My folder called Rainy Day, but yes, same idea. You break out that folder on a rainy day, mentally or actually.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the title Outcomes Over Hours. Just a side note, when I was toying around with having it as what my program would be based on, I chatted with a friend of mine who's a CEO of a services firm, so where they bill by the hour, and he said, I hate it. And I said, okay, tell me more. And he said, well, I need the hours because that's how my company bills. We don't bill on the outcomes, we bill on the hours. And if you think back to lawyers or, with the 6-minute billable slot, that type of thing, I said, well, maybe there's a different business model to consider of billing by the milestones for the hours so the hours don't become important. And he goes, okay, I'll think about that one. So it is definitely a different way that a lot of organizations are going to, but it's okay that not everyone's there yet, but there is a better way of working out there. So I'd love to finish off, Kaitlin, by asking you some rapid fire questions. Are you up for it?
I'm ready.
Okay. So what is the best thing that you've purchased for under roughly $100 over the last 5 years?
So a lot of my purchases under $100, I wouldn't qualify as best. They're random things. And one thing I spend a lot of money on is going to the coffee shop and buying, I think, gosh, last night it was like $7.50 for a latte. So the best purchase I've made for under $100 is a cold brew maker. It was about $75. You put just the regular ground coffee into it, which, for a week's worth is like $6. And I have my cold brew concentrate for the entire week. So talk about return on investment. I spent, $80 upfront capital investment plus my $6 variable cost each week. And I save, what is that, $7.50 times 5 days a week? I end up saving a lot of money with my cold brew maker.
Amazing, amazing. And what is the book that you've either recommended or gifted most to other people?
So an amazing faculty member I had the chance to work with at Dartmouth, Ron Adner, wrote this book called Winning the Right Game. And it's all about innovation ecosystem construction. And a year ago, around the same time that I had that conversation with that CHRO, I revisited that book and it completely changed the way I think about constructing the work-learn ecosystem. And I still keep in touch with Ron. In fact, I was having a beer with him last summer and I was explaining all my crazy thinking to him. And he's like, oh yeah, no, this all makes sense. So highly recommend the book. And if not the book, the audiobook, because it is Ron Adner reading Ron Adner, because he said, nobody else can read my book. It is my book, but highly recommend it. Really great practical advice for business leaders on how to think beyond the confines of industry to the level of ecosystem.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I love that you say it's practical as well. There's a lot of information out there. We need practical stuff. Fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the quote or phrase that you live by?
So I am a big Peloton fan, and there's one instructor. I sound like a horrible millennial saying this, but I'm a big Peloton fan, and there's one instructor in particular who I really admire called Christine Dickel, and her kind of catchphrase is, I am, I can, I will, I do. And there's been so many times, whether I'm on the bike or with my kids, sometimes on a particularly challenging rainy Saturday, or at work, where I just repeat that mantra to myself, and it's really gotten me through.
Fabulous. And finally, Kaitlin, what does outcomes over hours mean to you?
So I think, and we were talking a little bit about this before the interview, but while outcomes over hours is great, the question that comes up for me is the how of it. How do I achieve outcomes over hours? And for me, it's another O, optimize your hours. And that's a uniquely individual and personal thing. And it's seasonal. It changes over time. As I mentioned, with my 2 kids under the age of 5, optimizing for my hours, it's going to look very different than it did for me in my mid-20s, and will look very differently for me at a different stage of my life. So to achieve outcomes over hours, it's all about how do you optimize the hours for yourself.
Oh, wonderful. I love that definition of it. Well, Kaitlin Dumont, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Outcomes Over Hours show.
Thank you, Tina. It's been my pleasure.